Hello and welcome. My name is Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist and I'm based in Harley Street in London in the United Kingdom. And I'm delighted to be joined now by Carlos Fraenkel, who teaches philosophy and religion at McGill University in Montreal. He's the author of books including Philosophical Religions from Plato to Spinoza, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, the London Review of Books, and the Times Literary Supplement, amongst other publications. I'm talking to Carlos now because he's just published a new book entitled Teaching Plato in Palestine, Philosophy in a Divided World. And this book is published by Princeton University Press. So let me start, Carlos, by asking you, what was your thinking in terms of the general thesis behind this book? In the introduction, you talk about the book introducing the notion, or based on the notion, of a culture of debate. And you wanted to transform disagreement into a culture of debate. And you talked about a joint search for truth. And you seem to spend your time in the book visiting communities who often have very, very firm beliefs and seem to be mired in conflict with other groups. So tell us a bit about the thinking behind the book and the practical application of your ideas, and why you went to meet practically people who had very firm ideas and often were embedded in conflict.
Yeah, right. So that's a very good question. I think the ideas for this book already started taking shape in early 2000 when I was actually finishing up my PhD dissertation, which was on medieval Arabic and Hebrew philosophical texts. And at the time, I really felt the need to brush up on my Arabic. And so I went for 3 months to Cairo. And there I studied with a private teacher, but I also organized a kind of informal language exchange with Egyptian students on the side. So we would get together and we would speak some English because they were keen to practice their English, and then we would speak some Arabic. So that was an opportunity for me to practice my Arabic. And over time, we became friends. And the better we got to know each other, the more we also became concerned about our our strikingly different ways of life. So they wanted to convert me to Islam to save my soul, so to speak, from eternally burning in hell. And I wanted to convert them to the secular worldview that I grew up with, because I didn't want them to waste their real life for what I think is the illusion of an afterlife. So they would argue things like, if you become a Muslim, it's really a 3-in-1 deal, because Islam also recognizes in a certain way the truth of Judaism and Christianity. And I would reply, well, but I don't believe in God at all. And in one of these discussions, the question came up whether there is a proof for God's existence. And that question at the time really took me by surprise, because in the social and academic circles I normally move in, it's not the kind of question I get very often, right? Over beer in a bar in Manhattan or Montreal or Berlin or so. People usually don't ask me if there's a proof for God's existence. And so I said, I think there's no such proof. They, of course, came up with a proof. I pointed out a flaw in their reasoning. They came up with an improved version, and the discussion ended inconclusively. Now, I didn't convert to Islam at the time, and they didn't become atheists, but I did learn something very important from these discussions, namely that I hadn't really thought through properly some of the most basic convictions that I lived by, from my atheism to my ideas of what the good life consists in. And so this was really kind of like a wake-up call. And so here I found myself discussing philosophical questions with people in the street, people who didn't have any formal background in philosophy, who were not trained as philosophers, and I was really greatly enjoying these conversations. And so one of the big questions I grapple with in this book is, can we take out philosophy out of the traditional academic setting, out of the traditional classroom, and somehow make it relevant to real life concerns? But now to say something about this idea of a culture of debate that you mentioned. So I realized that actually having discussions across culture and religious divisions, as I was having there in Cairo, can be very productive, precisely because it confronts us with our prejudices that we often are not aware of. Right? So I was really forced to argue for views that I normally am not forced to argue for. And so the other big question that I grapple with in this book is basically, can we use philosophy to ground what I call a culture of debate, which is basically an intellectual space where we can discuss things that we deeply care about, but also deeply disagree on across cultural and religious divides, as I was doing with these Egyptian students in Cairo. So I think this is really the starting point for this book. And so, what I try to do in the book is show by example that we can take philosophy out of the classroom, and also show that philosophy can be useful to ground this culture of debate where we have these discussions across these divides.
Well, the book is fascinating and a gripping read, and you cover many philosophical issues like having a strong commitment to belief, the question of does God exist, is piety worth it, can violence be justified, what is social justice, and you do that in various philosophical workshops all across the world. I just want to pick up on that metaphysical proof of whether God exists or not. You touch on it in a small amount in the book. You don't go into it in a great deal of detail because obviously you cover a lot of other things, but let's just talk a little bit about that. As I understand it, and I'm sure you're going to correct me, that proof is the Avicenna proof about infinite regress and first cause, about the idea that when you try to figure out why something happens or what causes stuff, you go back to a cause before, and then you say, well, why does that cause exist? You go back to a cause before. And one of the arguments or the metaphysical proof that God exists is that God represents first cause. In other words, even physicists have problems when they go back to the Big Bang. If you ask them the question, if the Big Bang is the first event that starts the universe off, what caused the Big Bang? What happened before the Big Bang? So scientists run into trouble when they go back into this infinite regress of trying to sort out what happened right at the beginning. What was the first cause of everything? And the best way of thinking about that first cause is that is God. Is that a fair summary of the argument?
Yeah, I think that's basically correct. So they basically came up with a version of what philosophers sometimes call the metaphysical proof of God, which, as you pointed out, is often attributed to the medieval Islamic philosopher Avicenna, who lived in the 10th century, and it's a very elegant proof and fairly simple proof, and I think you summarized it really quite well. It's called the metaphysical proof because it hinges on certain notions of existence, right? It connects contingent existence and necessary existence, and the basic argument is that things that exist contingently, so that depend on a cause for their existence, they are not necessary existence, but that you cannot pursue this chain of causes and effects to infinity, so an infinite regress is not possible, so you have to somehow get to a cause that does not depend on other causes, on prior causes, that is not contingent, but that is necessary. So if you accept this basic distinction between contingent existence and necessary existence, and if you accept the premise that an infinite regress is not possible, then you basically have to concede that the chain of causes and effects must be initiated by something that exists necessarily, that exists in virtue of itself, that does not depend on causes outside itself, so that's not contingent. So I think that's a fair summary of that proof.
But although you don't go into it in great detail, you then come up with an argument against that, don't you?
Yeah, that's right. So so one way of questioning it is to say, well, I don't accept the premise that an infinite regress is not possible. Maybe our universe just consists in an infinite chain of causes and effects, and there is no starting point. There is no necessary cause that somehow is responsible for the whole thing. So that's one way of posing an objection to that proof. So rejecting one of the basic premises on which it is based. They might then reply that actually, even if you have an infinite series of contingent causes, you still need a necessary cause that is somehow responsible for bringing that infinite series of contingent causes and effects into existence. So they might have a reply to that objection that I mentioned. And so, so you can really get into a fairly elaborate discussion here, and so I don't think there is a conclusive answer to who is right on this and who is wrong.
Okay. Now, the other key concept you introduce in the book is the notion of fallibilism, which you seem to think is very important and might be very helpful in resolving some of the big conflicts that exist in the world. Tell us what you mean by fallibilism.
Right, so fallibilism is basically conceding that even though we have belief on the big issues such as God's existence or the origin of the universe or what a good life consists in or what good politics consists in or how politics should relate to religion and so forth. We have beliefs on these issues, and often we have strong convictions on these issues, but that doesn't entail that we're actually correct on these issues. And conceding that we may be wrong, even though we have strong beliefs, strong convictions, that's basically what I mean by fallibilism. So if one makes that into a principled position where one always says, even though I have some evidence supporting my views, but I don't have conclusive evidence supporting my views, and I remain open to revising them at any point, then I think then you're basically a fallibilist. Then you're someone who can be described as a fallibilist. So it's basically the view that your convictions might turn out to be wrong at some point, that they're always in some sense preliminary.
So another way of thinking about that is it means you're open-minded.
Yeah, that's correct. So basically, what I want to avoid in this project is, both the Aeschyla of relativism and skepticism and the Charybdis of a kind of Stalinist, oppressive, suffocating concept of absolute truth that we impose on everyone. So fallibilism in some sense tries to steer a middle way. Obviously, if you are a relativist who says everyone has his or her own truth, then a culture of debate where we try to figure it out together becomes useless, because there is no truth that we can in the end agree on, that we can strive to grasp. If you are a skeptic, the same applies, right? So you will in principle say that the truth is inaccessible to us. Maybe there is an objective truth out there, but human reason is simply unable, doesn't have the power to grasp it. And so so these two approaches would make a culture of debate, this idea of a joint search for the truth, basically useless from the outset. So I need something stronger than that, but I also don't want to impose some kind of absolute truth that I think everyone has to somehow to submit to. And so fallibilism, I think, gives me an elegant way out, and I think we have good reasons to be fallibilists, because on most questions, I think there is no conclusive. On most big questions, there is no conclusive evidence that that clearly favors one answer over others. So so I think fallibilism is not only a useful position, but it's, I think, also a well-supported position.
But the problem is that many skeptics of the philosophical approach that you argue in the book would say the fallibilism view, which is you kind of saying, well, I might be wrong, doesn't seem passionate or strident. It doesn't seem persuasive. It seems a little bit docile. It seems resigned. You're not coming out fighting for your side in an argument if you adopt the fallibilist position. It just feels that way.
Right, but that's not what I mean. So I also advocate in the book a position that I call critical ethnocentrism. So and that's in part critical of, let's say, advocates of multiculturalism, who think that everyone should just live and think according to their own way and follow their own tradition. So I do think that we should fight for our convictions, and I'm always willing to defend mine. And I think in the book I try not to come across as an easy pushover. So I try to come up with objections. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't hide from my Egyptian friends that I was an atheist, and I didn't somehow just leave them in their beliefs, but I tried to convince them as they tried to convince me. I think there's nothing wrong with standing up for one's convictions, but I don't think that one will be interested in engaging in a debate if one takes one's convictions for the absolute and definitive and unquestionable truth, right? So I think another condition for a culture of debate to be able to take off is really that one has at least some intellectual humility and says, I may be wrong. I do believe that I'm right, and I'm happy to defend my views, and I'm passionate about my views, and I try to convince others that I am right. But nonetheless, it may turn out that in the end, there are arguments that show that I am wrong. So I don't really see these two things as being incompatible, to be passionate about one's views and to concede that these views might turn out to be wrong.
Okay, I mean, another bit of the book you mention, I think it may come from Socrates, the notion of techniques of debate and virtues of debate. And it seemed to me that you had to kind of lay the groundwork a bit with many of the students you encountered in your workshops over what these techniques of debate are and the virtues of debate. Could you say something about that?
Sure. So I think it's very important that I mention, at least briefly, what I actually mean by philosophy when I talk about philosophy in this book. And so what I don't mean by philosophy is some kind of grand philosophical theory such as Marxism or existentialism or something else. So what I mean is something really much more simple, much more deflated. As you said, on the one hand, techniques of debate, so logical and semantic tools that we can use to simply clarify what we mean when we talk with others, to make an argument, to respond to an argument, so basically what one could call the toolkit of the philosopher. And secondly, as you also mentioned, virtues of debate, and here I think the most important virtue is a certain attitude where we love the truth more than we love winning an argument. So when I talk about culture of debate, what I don't mean is the kind of debates that you have in high schools where the goal is to somehow prevail over the other no matter what. But what I mean is really a serious attempt to find out the truth where winning the argument is not your primary aim. And so I think these two things, which I think are fairly simple, so these techniques of debate and these virtues of debate, I think they would be sufficient for having productive discussions, for making the differences that we have, for making the disagreements on many fundamental moral, religious, and philosophical questions that we have productive, to make them intellectually useful.
Now, what's really interesting about what you've just said there is that one of the problems, it seems to me, although it's a very interesting project, yours of bringing philosophy out of the academic common room and out into the world, and the world that's red in tooth and claw in terms of conflict and wars, for example, is you said the point of the seeking after truth is not just to prevail over the other side, but is to pursue the truth no matter what. But that when we come out of the academic common room, when we find ourselves in the real world, as it were, we discover that the point of the world, as I think Karl Marx would have argued, is precisely to prevail over the other side. In other words, it's the power dynamic that seems most important between nations, between people, between organizations, in politics, and so on and so forth, rather than the pursuit of truth.
Right. So, and I am not someone who has these very inflated expectations of what philosophy can do. My wife sometimes jokingly says that I should take down ISIS and then I would get the Nobel Prize. So I don't think philosophy can take down ISIS. I think you have to choose the right means for the purpose that you are pursuing, and sometimes you need fighter jets to achieve something, and sometimes you need philosophical arguments to achieve something. If you are fighting an occupation or so, philosophical arguments might not be enough. But I think philosophical arguments might help you think through some of the basic moral and political questions that underlie certain conflicts, right? So that's why I think that doing philosophy might not be a sufficient condition for achieving the results that one desires, but it might be one of the conditions that may help to get to the goal.
So in these workshops where you traveled across the world and you encountered people who had very firmly held beliefs, I'm going to ask you a very dangerous and provocative question. Did anyone change their minds? And did you change your mind?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So my expectation is actually not so much that people will change their minds, and I don't think that I changed my mind on any of the fundamental issues. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I had these extended discussions with Egyptian students about many fundamental questions, but I did not convert to Islam, and they did not become atheists. So we, in some sense, remained with our initial positions. What I do think that there are of course exceptions. So there are conversion experiences, right? So sometimes someone indeed moves over from atheism to becoming a religious, to becoming a believer, and sometimes people move over to the other side. But I think what you can expect to come out of this debate is, or let's say a more reasonable expectation is to for people to revise their views, to make their views more sophisticated, to find better arguments to support their views, to refine their views. Basically, I think this is a more realistic expectation, and so people might remain with the initial positions that they started out with, but they might rethink these positions, and they might be able to better defend them, to give better arguments for them, and they might also become aware of the fact that these positions are not definitive, and that there are counter arguments to them. So they might move to fallibilism from being completely convinced of the truth of their views.
Well, it's fascinating talking to you, but we're running out of time a little bit. But I want to put a couple of final points to you, or final questions about your brilliant book.
Sure.
One of the things that comes through with the book is the sociable nature of philosophy. A lot of people outside of philosophy might consider it a rather dry, abstruse, remote, aloof, academic subject. And yet your conveyance of philosophy is it's incredibly sociable. You engage with people. They engage back with you. You argue with each other. But there's a sense in which it's a very sociable subject. It's a very argumentative subject, but sociable. And so I want to get your views on that. But also, there is a sense in which it's also very threatening, because you can trap people in a contradiction. You can expose people to a very threatening idea that actually there's an implicit contradiction often in their belief systems. And as a result of people feeling psychologically threatened by that, they will want to shut philosophy out. They'll want to shut logic out, or thinking very clearly. So any views about that tension between the sociability and the threat that comes with clear thinking?
Right. I mean, so to respond to the first part of your question, so after I had this experience in Cairo that I mentioned, which goes back all the way to early 2000, I then later organized these philosophy workshops in different hotspots around the world. So you mentioned the Palestinian University, where I did a workshop in 2006. Then I did one at a State Islamic University in Indonesia. I did one with a group of lapsed Hasidic Jews in New York City. I did another workshop with teenagers in Brazilian high schools in mostly poor neighborhoods in Brazil. And I did a last one with a Mohawk community, so a First Nations or Native American community on the border between Canada and the US. And all these places are places fraught with conflict of very different types, obviously. So Israel and Palestine, of course, Islam and the West, but also something like religious orthodoxy and modernity in the case of Hasidic Jews in New York City, or social and racial divisions in Brazil, and obviously the scars of colonialism in the case of this Native American community. And these conflicts, I think, they give rise to fundamental questions that people in these places are anyway already grappling with, right? So does God exist? Is piety worth it? Is violence justified? Obviously an important question in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What is social justice and how can we get there? Who should rule? What does political self-determination require, which is a key question in these First Nations communities. And so what I basically claim here is that one can embed philosophy, that one can embed the tools of philosophy in these discussions that are already going on the ground. So I think these are philosophically very rich questions that arise from these real-life situations, and people are already grappling with these questions. They're already having these discussions, and I think one can improve on these discussions that people are having by embedding philosophical tools into them. If you take the example of Indonesia, for example, I went to Indonesia actually together with my wife, who is a public health physician, and so I started a chapter in Indonesia with this question: what is more important to teach in Indonesia, philosophy or public health? And I don't argue that teaching philosophy is more important than teaching public health, but I do argue that teaching philosophy is important, especially in a country like Indonesia that is really, grappling with some very fundamental questions with this transition from a dictatorship to a democracy. Questions such as, is Islam compatible with a democracy? Is Islam compatible with religious pluralism? Because there are significant religious minorities in Indonesia, Christians, but also Buddhists and Hindus. Is Islam compatible with modernization, which has been pushed in Indonesia over the last couple of decades, and so forth, right? So these are all, difficult and challenging questions that Indonesians are dealing with. and where I think the tools of philosophy can be helpful to think them through. So in that sense, I really think that philosophy can be useful, can be embedded into the kinds of questions and discussions that people already have. Now, to address the second part of your questions, whether philosophy can actually, in some sense, be disconcerting and make people insecure and try to shut out philosophy because they are being confronted with the contradictions and inconsistencies. I think that's possible. And again, the probably most prominent example of a philosopher to whom that happened is Socrates, right? So he goes around in Athens and asks people all these challenging, provocative questions, which confront them with their ignorance, right? So he basically always leaves them with this impression that that what they pretended and what they claim to know, they don't really know. Everyone knows how this ended for Socrates. Everyone knows what the fate of Socrates was. So, so philosophy can be unpleasant and, uncomfortable in this sense. Socrates is described as a gadfly, right? So that's not a very, pleasant association, the gadfly. But I think that in our time, in some sense, I would say, nobody can really escape from being exposed to lifestyles and belief systems that are very alien from one's own, that are very different from one's own, right? So globalization and immigration and a global economy and travel and media and so forth, they constantly confront us with people who live in a way that is different from ours, who believe things that are different from ours. So I think that in some sense this kind of questioning that Socrates tried to induce through his method of examination already exists in our time as a natural byproduct of the kind of global society that we live in, and where we constantly are interacting across all kinds of cultural, religious, linguistic, political, and so forth boundaries, right? So I think the questions are already there, and what I'm trying to do is transform them into something that then becomes really an interesting, productive, and useful discussion. Now, I don't think that disagreements and differences in themselves can generate an interesting discussion. I do think that these techniques and virtues that we talked about earlier should ideally be they should be made part of social discourse by as it were, implementing them or integrating them into the high school curriculum, so that people from early on, from the late teenage years on, get used to participating in these kinds of discussions. I think if that's the case, I think people will develop a taste for it. They will have the tools for doing it, and they will see the benefits of doing it. So I think it requires a certain also political effort to make these differences and disagreements that we're dealing with in day-to-day life productive.
Carlos Fraenkel, thank you very much indeed. The book is entitled Teaching Plato in Palestine, Philosophy in a Divided World, and it's published by Princeton University Press. Carlos, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, Raj, thank you so much for having me and for this interesting discussion.